Fowler's Ghost. Now, I'm gonna warn you guys up front, a few of the choices I made have actually appeared on some of my worst trains ever lists because, let's be fair, if a locomotive is out to kill the people operating it, that means it's probably really bad. Now, not all of them have been talked about before, but a couple of them have, and this is one of them. But for those of you who may have missed that episode, or are new to the channel, hello by the way, Fowler's Ghost was an experimental fireless 240 steam locomotive, and it was designed by John Fowler, constructed in 1861. John Fowler, by the way, was an English civil engineer, and he specialized in the construction of railways and railway infrastructure. Fowler's Ghost actually wasn't the official name of the locomotive, but the name was given to it by the Railway magazine in a retrospective article that was published in January of 1901, because Fowler was a respected engineer and the locomotive was a deeply embarrassing subject for him. So much so that after it was scrapped, he denied it ever existed. Now you may be wondering, how is a steam locomotive fireless? After all, that's kind of an integral part of any steam locomotive, and that's very true. Well, the solution to this was twofold. For one thing, the locomotive was designed to actually recycle excess steam. Through complicated but admittedly somewhat innovative mechanics, the locomotive was capable of recondensing steam that it had already used and feed it back into its own boiler. And it actually wasn't fireless all the time. It operated conventionally in the open, but the idea of the locomotive was to operate in tunnel systems. A big problem in those days was the utilization of steam locomotives in tunnels. As you can imagine, the smoke from a steam locomotive going through a tunnel can be pretty overwhelming for a crew, and there's a reason we generally use electric locomotives in subways, for example. However, there was another issue that plagued Fowler's Ghost, and that's where we get into the lethality of it. You see, the Ghost used fire bricks for the heat when it wasn't using an open flame. Its completely normal firebox was connected to a combustion chamber that contained fire bricks, which are blocks of ceramic material that absorb and retain a tremendous amount of heat if they're left near a source of it. The thought was that when the fire had to be damped out so the engine didn't release smoke in the tunnels, the fire bricks would retain enough heat to keep the engine going until it got out of the tunnels. But on its first trial run, the boiler feed pumps, namely the things that put water in it, jammed. The crew had no way of putting more water into the locomotive, and unlike a traditional steam locomotive, which can simply drop out the fire onto the rails to cool the boiler down, Fowler's Ghost had no way of getting rid of those fire bricks. They were too hot to remove by hand, and they couldn't drop them out of the engine. It came very close to detonating, but thankfully this never occurred. Even without this major fault, its second trial didn't go well either, because it just didn't steam well. The mechanics were interesting, but the engine just wasn't as efficient as Fowler thought it would be, and it was considered a complete failure. Fowler went on to make some excellent tank engines in 1864, known as the A-Class, and with updates, the B-Class, so he was definitely able to maintain his reputation after this mistake. The IE-201 class. These locomotives were actually built by General Motors in 1994 and 1995, specifically for North Ireland Railways and Irish Rail. For their time, they were actually very good, at least on paper. They were very powerful at 3,200 horsepower, and very fast at 102 miles per hour. Now, I put them low on the list because sometimes they're alright, and they're actually still in service as far as my research shows, but they've had some teething problems over the years that has resulted in certain issues. Bogie cracks, for example, were common on them, and that's never a good thing, but the one big problem that was really alarming had to do with their head-end power. Head-end power is pretty common on trains nowadays. It basically allows the engine to supply power to the rest of the train. This can be used for heating, charging batteries, etc. If you've been on a modern train, you've probably been on a coach that has an outlet for you to charge your phone. That usually has to do with the head-end power. These locomotives were equipped with it, which is fine, but when the head-end power was utilized, it had a tendency to overheat, especially when the locomotive was traveling at very high speeds. This actually resulted in at least one bursting into flame. As a result of this, as well as the outrageous noise that the head-end power on these actually caused at stations, they don't even use it anymore. Nowadays, they'll use generator vans instead to supply the power to the train, rather than taking it from the locomotive itself. It seems to be a weird limitation, as most modern passenger units should be able to use head-end power without this kind of a problem. But the 201s? No, I think it's best if we don't. I would prefer not to have another one burst into flame. I think that's cool. I think that's a great concept. Let's not do that. London, Midland and Scottish Railway, number 6399, Fury. I still love that name, because this is yet another locomotive that also appeared on my list of bad trains, and if you watch that part, you know exactly why, because I did definitely talk about this problem when I mentioned why it was so bad. The Fury was designed to be a high-pressure steam locomotive. The actual difference between high-pressure steam and low-pressure steam can actually vary a little bit depending on the era you're talking about, or the mechanics involved, but generally speaking, a typical steam locomotive of this era would be operating between 200 to 250 psi. High pressure steam is considered to start at around 350 psi, and that's great and all, except for the fact that the Fury, in its original form, could operate at up to 1,800 psi. So, okay, that's a very high pressure, and the whole point of it was to seek out possible new designs for the future of steam locomotives, something that could push steam forward into the modern age, and the Fury absolutely did not do that! Its inner workings just couldn't handle the extreme pressure it was working at, making things incredibly dangerous, and this is the first one on the list that actually does have a technical body count. On the 10th of February 1930, the locomotive was approaching Carstairs Station at low speed. While it was doing this, one of the ultra-high pressure tubes inside of it burst, and the escaping steam ejected the coal fire through the door to the firebox, and killed one Mr. Lewis Schofield of the Superheater Company. The post-investigation of the accident couldn't actually figure out why the tube had burst, and after repair, it did actually carry out some more trials until early 1934, but ultimately they couldn't make it work well and in a safe way. So it was eventually scrapped, but that actually happened way later. And this was a little bit of a flub of mine when I first talked about it. It was scrapped eventually, but not before being converted into a Royal Scot Class number 6170 British Legion. Apparently this locomotive just loved awesome names. And it actually served in that form until 1962, and then it was scrapped. The British Rail Class 220 2005 refit. No, get out of here! It's not time for you yet. I know I said your name, but this was after you went defunct. You don't belong here. Get out! Out! Out with you! Begone, scourge of trains everywhere. The British Rail Class 220, also known as a Voyager, is a diesel-electric high-speed multiple-unit passenger train. It was actually constructed in Belgium by Bombardier. They were introduced in 2001, and they were meant to replace the Intercity 125s. They were originally operated by Virgin Cross Country, and since 2007 have just been operated by simply Cross Country. They're actually still in service now, and to be honest, most of the time they're actually alright. They're not so amazing that I put them on best trains ever lists, but they're not really awful, so I wouldn't say they were bad, except for one situation. See, between 2005 and 2006, the locomotives went through a refit. This is not unusual. Parts wear in trains all the time. You need to go in, refit them, refurbish them, whatever you have to do. There's nothing unusual about that in particular. What was unusual was that the refit didn't actually go well. It was done completely wrong. The result of this mistake was that the 220s began to suffer exhaust fires. Just all the time. Fortunately, due to modern safety standards, it doesn't seem like this ever managed to kill anybody. But it could have, and the mistakes in the refit were resolved pretty quickly. So nowadays, no, they probably will not spontaneously combust. But there was a brief time in 2006 where there was the potential for that. British Rail Class 21. I would like to personally and publicly thank my Discord server for supplying me with both the idea and some of the suggestions for this list. It was they that insisted that the 21 had to go on the list again. And to be fair, with a concept like this, yeah, I can't avoid it, but I really wanted to. And you guys were just like, no, but it did. It burst into flame. You gotta talk about it again. Fine. Ugh. Built by the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow for British Rail between 1958 and 1960, 58 of these horrific monstrosities were created, and they are probably one of, if not the worst, diesels to come out of the modernization plan. They were terrible. Everything went wrong on these things. The diesel engine itself was actually based off of a German design, which in the original German form was very good. But when NBL constructed them, they utilized inferior quality materials, and that resulted in just so many problems. The cooling systems weren't adequate, and the engines leaked, not being constructed to the appropriate tolerances of operation. Their cylinder heads fractured, and the lubricating oil escaped into the battery compartments. Now, those flaws were mostly rectified during a rebuilding program between 1961 and 1962, but the positioning of minor components within the locomotive's body shell meant that smaller faults, of which there were a lot, could only be rectified on depot or by return to a railway workshop, which resulted in poor availability. But the big issue, and this is why they were so dangerous, and why some were actually scrapped because of it, was that they had a habit of catching fire. The engine rooms often burst into flames, and it rode off several of the locomotives, to the point that allegedly, I have found no concrete evidence of this, but apparently, for a while, British Rail actually didn't even utilize brand new models of this diesel that they would receive. The problems were so bad that they would just throw them into storage, not even putting them on the rails, because what was the point? They were going to break anyway, and they might get somebody killed. Even British Rail didn't want to deal with that. Plenty of their other diesels were having issues about this time, but none of those issues were as lethal as fire. The 21s kind of stand out in that regard, but they were rebuilt and re-engined into Class 29s. The 29s were better, but they were non-standard after only a short time, and as a result didn't actually stick around that long, all being retired by 1971, and every single one of them was scrapped. The General Electric C39-8. There were a lot of General Electric suggestions for this list, and there's a very major reason for that. Early General Electrics especially had major issues with their turbochargers. The turbochargers had a tendency to leak fuel into the exhaust. This was due to a variety of faults, but it usually resulted in this exact thing you're looking at. Even modern-day General Electric sometimes suffer from this problem, and I still don't know why General Electric keeps getting away with this nonsense, because I can't imagine any railroad wants to deal with a diesel that has a pillar of flame jutting out from the top of it. The C39-8s, in particular, were a lot worse in this regard. They already had bad riding characteristics and had a tendency to overheat, but their turbocharger issues were bad even by Dash 8 standards, and those weren't very good standards when it came to the turbochargers. Their fuel injectors were awful, and exhaust fires were frequent. Less than 200 were actually produced, and only one, as of 2021, is considered operational, at least in the United States. That's former Norfolk Southern 8212, who's at the Pennsylvania Northeastern Railroad's main yard in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. Sitting in storage, not actually in operation, but capable of it. They probably don't want to do that because they enjoy not being caught on fire. The New South Wales 41 class locomotive. Oh boy. The 41 class were built by British Thomson Euston in the United Kingdom, specifically for the New South Wales Department of Railways in 1953 and 1954. NSW actually ordered 10 diesel locomotives from Australian General Electric, but they sublet the contract to British Thomson Euston, and the body was actually built by Metro Camel of Birmingham. But if there was one diesel on the rails that could ever be called a pyromaniac, it'd probably be this one, right up there with the Class 21s and anything General Electric that's early and has a turbocharger. These things always overheated, and always caught on fire. Several modifications were rolled out to try to fix them, but eventually it was kind of seen as too expensive to do that to all of them. Additionally, they were actually equipped to operate in multiple setups, but they didn't do this because the cooling system saw that the radiator heat from the first locomotive would actually pass to the second one, causing the whole overheating thing to be marginally worse. They lasted barely 10 years before their Paxman engines were actually coming to an end of their useful life. By then, new Class 48s were on the horizon, which were much better. Impressively, one did wind up preserved, and is currently stored at the Broadmeadow Locomotive Depot, where you can still see it to this day. Early doodlebugs. I get to talk about doodlebugs! I'm so excited! I love doodlebugs! Look at it. Look at it. It's so cute. Doodlebug, or sometimes hoodlebugs, is actually just a nickname in the United States for a self-propelled railcar. Why do we call them doodlebugs, you may ask? I will answer this question. There's actually two reasons for it. The first one is that, well, have you ever seen these? You may not call them doodlebugs where you live, you may call them roly-polies or hillbugs, or maybe their actual name, which is armadillididae? Okay, I see why no one calls them that makes sense. But people thought that the rail cars actually kind of looked like them. And I guess at a glance they looked kind of insect-like. On top of that, they had a tendency to wobble gently as they went down the track, or doodle along the track. So doodlebug was a name that stuck. My worldwide audience may be getting confused, as in some places you call this a doodlebug, or this a doodlebug, or even this a doodlebug. It's a very overused name now that I really think about it. But the point is, doodlebugs were actually a fairly revolutionary idea on the rail lines. First of all, they weren't steam or electric. The early ones were driven by gasoline. Later they would become diesel, and this is a relevant topic that I will bring up later. And even though they were smaller than a full-size train, this was somewhat beneficial, as on smaller regional branch lines, you didn't need a full-size train with a steam locomotive. You could just throw a doodlebug on the line, and they could transport a small number of passengers where they needed to go, and make a profit while doing that. They were exceptional, and a ton of railways wound up using them. However, the early ones had a fairly major flaw, and it was because they were designed to run on gasoline, particularly the ones that were employed by the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, there were several problems with utilizing gasoline in this manner. For one thing, gasoline has a much lower flash point than diesel fuel. It will much more readily burst into flame well before thick diesel fuel will. That in itself isn't a horrifying prospect. After all, plenty of cars on the roads use gasoline. But what was a bit more alarming was that the design of these doodlebugs, which were PRR class GEW 275, caused the exhaust of the engine to leak into the driver's cab. You may recognize this as being alarmingly dangerous, as it can very easily lead to what we know as carbon monoxide poisoning. And even in 1940, they knew the dangers of carbon monoxide. And even though drivers complained about this, the railroad didn't seem too concerned about the problem. This little teeny tiny itsy bitsy problem that could easily incapacitate and or kill their drivers was not actually addressed until July 31st, 1940, when what is known as the Doodlebug disaster happened in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. The Doodlebug involved, number 4648, was supposed to pull off to a siding and let a big heavy freight train pass. But because the driver was suffering the early effects of carbon monoxide poisoning, he completely missed and bypassed the siding, causing a head-on collision that killed 43 people, all of whom were on board the Doodlebug. It was only after the investigation revealed that he had been incapacitated by the carbon monoxide that the Pennsy realized, oh, right, maybe having our drivers inhaling poisonous fumes might not be the best call. So the issue was addressed, and the vast majority of doodlebugs after this point ran on diesel fuel, which not only was less likely to burst into flame, like Doodlebug 4648 did, but were designed to send their noxious fumes outside, away from people's lungs, so you don't get any more people killed. I don't know why it took 43 deaths for you to figure that out. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.